Story 1: Shadows on the County Bridge. It was one of those nights when the rain doesn't fall in drops so much as it pours in heavy curtains, smearing everything outside into a shifting watercolor of dark greens and blacks. I'd been driving the back way home from work because Route 9 was washed out. Route 6 wasn't much better, narrow, unlit, and winding through miles of pine and oak with the kind of potholes that can crack an axle. But it was late, and I was tired, and I didn't want to add another hour going the long way around. The bridge came into view sooner than I expected. It's not much, just 100 feet of weathered planks laid across rusting steel beams, spanning a sluggish, coffee-colored river. Folks around here call it Miller's Crossing, though I've never met anyone who could tell me who Miller was. The boards groan under your tires when you go across, especially in damp weather. That night, they sounded almost alive, like a deep, low breathing under the noise of the storm. Halfway across, my truck coughed once, twice, and then died. No sputtering lead up, no flicker of the dashlights, just the engine going silent, leaving me sitting in the middle of the bridge with the rain hammering the cab so loud it felt like it was inside my skull. I tried the ignition again. Nothing, just a click. I should have felt irritated, maybe muttered under my breath about bad luck, but almost instantly, there was this other feeling, a tightening at the base of my throat, a crawling sense that I had stopped somewhere I wasn't supposed to stop. My headlights threw 2 weak cones through the rain, barely reaching the far end of the bridge before fading into the blur of dark forest. The rearview mirror showed the same thing behind me. No other cars, no movement, just me in a little bubble of dim light. I fished for my phone, thinking I could call my brother to come to me. The screen stayed blank no matter how many times I hit the power button. Water must have gotten into it earlier in the week when the window seals started leaking. So, no phone, no engine, and no shelter but my truck in the middle of this old, creaking bridge. That's when I heard it. It cut through the roar of the rain in a way that didn't make sense. Clear, deliberate, and close. Footsteps, not on the road, on the roof of my truck. A measured, heavy tread, each one separated by a pause, like whoever it was wanted me to hear every single step. The weight shifted the cab just enough for me to feel it through the seat. I couldn't make myself look up. I just stared straight ahead, hands frozen on the wheel. The rain was drumming so hard I couldn't tell if the footsteps were moving toward the hood or toward the bed, but they weren't in a hurry. They weren't cautious either. Just slow, steady pacing. I don't know how long I sat there before I realized I'd been holding my breath. I let it out in a shaky exhale and risked turning my head just enough to glance out the driver's side window. Through the blur of rain, something shifted ahead of me on the bridge. A shadow, darker than the rest, stepping down from the top of the cab onto the wet boards. It didn't run. It didn't even walk toward me. It just stood there in the middle of my headlights, though the beams seemed to dim around it. The strangest thing, rain was falling all around, hitting the planks, streaking past the beams of light, but not a drop touched that figure. I blinked hard, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks in the low light, but the shape didn't waver. I couldn't see a face, not even the outline of features, just the suggestion of shoulders. A head tilted slightly toward me. I wanted to honk, to do anything to break the stillness, but my hand wouldn't move from the wheel. My ears were ringing, though I couldn't tell if it was from fear or from how hard my heart was pounding. Then it took a step toward me. The sound was subtle, almost swallowed by the rain, but the boards groaned deep under its weight. I could feel the vibration travel through the truck. One step, then another, then it stopped again, about halfway between the front of my truck and the far end of the bridge. I don't know why, but the thought of it reaching the driver's side door was worse than anything else I could imagine. My body made the decision before my brain did. I slammed my hand onto the ignition and twisted hard. The engine roared to life like nothing had ever been wrong. I didn't even check the mirrors before flooring it, the tires spitting water as I shot across the remaining boards and onto the far side. I didn't slow down for 2 miles. When I finally glanced in the rear view, the bridge was just a dark smudge through the rain. But I swear, just before the curve took it out of sight, I saw a shadow still standing dead center in the road, exactly where I'd left it. I told myself I wouldn't take Route 6 again, not at night, not in the rain. But sometimes, when I'm driving home and the weather turns, I catch myself looking for that bridge in the distance and wondering if it's waiting. Story 2. The Man Beside the Mailbox. The rain had been coming down since late afternoon, the kind that doesn't so much fall as pour in solid sheets, each drop smacking hard against the windshield and bouncing. I had driven in bad weather before, but this was the kind that swallowed the world outside the glass, where even the high beams made no difference, just a brighter haze of water and shadow. My cousin lived on the far end of Hollow Ridge, past where the paved road turns to cracked asphalt, past where even the county seems to have forgotten about upkeep. I'd stayed longer than I should have, one more coffee, one more story, and now I was paying for it, crawling along in the dark with the wipers slapping as fast as they could go, still unable to keep up. The old Miller farm came up on the right, barely visible through the curtain of rain. I'd passed it 1,000 times over the years. An empty house, a sagging barn, a field that had long gone to weed. The mailbox had been leaning there for as long as I could remember, rust chewing at the sides, the paint so faded you could barely make out the name. But this time, as my headlights cut through the rain, I saw someone standing beside it. A man. No umbrella, no hat, no jacket, just standing there, hands at his sides, staring straight at my approaching truck. The water was soaking his clothes, but he didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even hunch his shoulders against the cold. I figured maybe his car had broken down, or he'd been out walking and gotten caught in the storm, though this road wasn't exactly one people strolled for fun. As I drew closer, I expected the lights to catch his face, to show me something. Eyes, skin, even just the glint of rain on his cheeks. But there was nothing. His head was there, angled toward me, but it was as though the beam of the headlight slid right past him, leaving his features in shadow. I slowed a little, thinking about stopping, but something in the way he stood gave me pause. People flagging down help on a rainy night usually wave, step forward, shout. This man didn't even shift his weight. He just watched. I eased past, keeping my eyes on him through the driver's side window. My mind was already chewing on possibilities. Maybe he was drunk, maybe sick, maybe worse. A part of me was still ready to stop if I saw a wrecked car nearby, but there was nothing but the empty drive curling up toward the Miller house. I checked my mirror as I rolled past, expecting to see him turning back toward the mailbox or maybe disappearing into the driveway. He was in the middle of the road. I know what I saw. The rain was hammering so hard the world beyond the glass was a smear, but he was there, centered in the lane, closer than he'd been seconds earlier, his arms hanging at his sides like before. I hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen him move, but he had closed the distance fast enough that it made my stomach twist. I pressed the gas without thinking, my tires hissing through the water pooling on the asphalt. The wipers clawed at the glass, giving me brief, clear glimpses of the road ahead. I didn't dare check the mirror again. I just kept going, past the last streetlight, into the stretch of Hollow Ridge where the forest leans in from both sides, and the road feels narrower than it is. Something about that moment stuck with me. Not fear in the usual sense, but the kind of wrongness you can't explain, the kind that works its way into your chest and stays there. I couldn't shake the thought that if I had stopped, if I had opened the door and stepped out into the rain, I might not have made it back in. And the worst part was the way he had looked, or hadn't looked. Like there was nothing for the light to catch, nothing for my brain to place in the shape of a human face. I got home without seeing another soul. The rain followed me the whole way, pounding the roof as I pulled into the drive. I kept the porch light on that night, even though I never do. It wasn't until I was inside, boots off, coat dripping on the rack, that I realized I was still holding my keys in a tight fist, knuckles sore from how hard I'd gripped them. For weeks after, whenever it rained, I'd catch myself watching the road from my window, scanning the dark between each pass of the wipers. I never saw him again, but there's one thing I've made certain of. And it isn't superstition, it's just a rule I live by now. If I'm driving past the Miller farm at night, I don't slow down. Not for anyone. Story 3. Rain in the attic. When my grandmother passed, the cabin came to me. It sat alone at the end of a dirt road that had long since been swallowed by weeds, deep in a fold of the mountains where cell service was a rumor and daylight felt shorter. I hadn't been there since I was a boy, but I remembered the smell of wood smoke, the worn creak of the floorboards, and the tin roof that sang in the rain. My mother hated the place, called it drafty, full of bugs, but I had always loved it. The thought of inheriting it felt almost like a gift, though one I wasn't sure I deserved. I drove up on a grey afternoon in early October. The air was already cooler at that elevation, sharp and damp, and by the time I pulled into the overgrown clearing, the wind had picked up enough to make the treetops hiss. The cabin was smaller than I remembered, the boards silvered with age, the porch sagging under the weight of years. Still, the sight of it stirred something in me, like I'd found my way back to a place I didn't know I'd been missing. Inside smelled the same, dry wood, dust, and that faint mineral tang that old places get when they've been closed up too long. I built a fire in the little wood stove, unpacked a few essentials, and made myself at home. The rain started just after sunset, tapping a gentle rhythm on the tin roof as I sat in my grandmother's old rocker. The sound was hypnotic, a steady pulse that pulled me deeper into the stillness of the room. By midnight, the fire had burned low, the cabin lit only by the shifting orange glow of coals. I was drowsy, listening to the rain when I realized something was off. The sound was no longer just above me, it was inside. A faint dripping, irregular at first, then steadier, like water leaking from a pipe. I frowned, remembering that the place had no running water upstairs, just the attic. Grabbing a flashlight, I climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under my weight. The drip seemed to move with me, retreating toward the far end of the house. At the top, I pulled down the attic ladder, wincing at the metallic scrape of hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. Warm, dry air drifted down from the darkness above. When I stuck my head up, my light swept across dusty beams and stacks of boxes my grandmother had left behind. Not a drop of water. The roof looked sound, and the floorboards under my feet were bone dry, but the dripping continued, louder now, though not wet at all. It had a hollow quality, like fingers tapping on wood. I stood still, listening. The sound began to move, circling slowly along the rafters overhead. Tap, 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 deliberate, measured, never too fast, never too slow. My light chased empty space, beams casting long shadows in the angles of the roof. The tapping went behind me. I turned sharply. Nothing. A cold unease settled into my stomach. I told myself it was just the wood contracting, maybe a squirrel or a bird that had gotten trapped inside. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became that this was not the random scurry of an animal. It had weight, intent. The spacing between each tap was almost like counting. I forced myself to take a few steps forward, sweeping the light across the far corner. Dust hung in the air, shimmering in the beam, and for an instant I thought I saw the shape of a hand withdraw behind a support post. My pulse spiked, but when I crossed the floor there was nothing there, just a faint scuff in the dust, like something had dragged its fingers lightly across it. The tapping stopped. The silence was worse. I backed toward the ladder, my light still searching the rafters. Just before I lowered myself down, the sound started again, but this time it was directly above me, fast and sharp, like a burst of impatient drumming. I dropped the flashlight in my hurry, its beam rolling across the attic floor, and climbed down without bothering to pull the ladder up behind me. I locked the bedroom door that night, though it wouldn't have done much good. The rain continued outside, steady and calming, but I lay awake until dawn, listening for that other rhythm, the one that didn't belong. In the morning, the attic was exactly as I'd left it. No footprints in the dust, no signs of intrusion. I told myself it must have been the wind shifting the beams, maybe a raccoon. But even now, weeks later, every time it rains, I hear that sound in my head, slow, measured tapping, circling, as if whatever was up there had all the time in the world to wait. And sometimes, on the worst nights, I think I hear it again. Not above me this time, but closer, somewhere just beyond the bedroom wall. Story 4. The passenger window. It was past 1 in the morning when I finally clocked out. The rain had been falling since before sunset, but by the time I pulled onto the highway, it had turned into a hard, cold sheet, hammering the windshield so loud it was like gravel being poured across the glass. My wipers were on full tilt, slapping frantically, but they barely kept up. The route home was muscle memory at this point. 30 minutes along Route 14, then cutting through Ash Fork Hollow before the road looped back toward town. Most people avoided the hollow after dark. It wasn't superstition, just practicality. The trees pressed in tight there, and the road twisted on itself with blind curves. On a clear night, it felt claustrophobic. In a storm like this, it was like driving into a throat that kept closing. I wasn't more than a mile into the hollow when I caught the movement, just the faintest shift in my peripheral vision, but enough to send a jolt through me. My head turned automatically, and my stomach flipped. Someone was sitting in my passenger seat. It wasn't like seeing a shape in the shadows and thinking it could be something. It was immediate recognition. There was the outline of a shoulder, the faint slump of posture, the space taken up in a way my brain registered as a person. My heart hit hard against my ribs, and in that frozen half-second before I could breathe, I snapped my eyes fully toward it. There was nothing there. No one. No jacket, no shadow, no movement, just the empty seat. But the belt, the passenger seat belt, was drawn tight across the cushion. I watched it as I drove, barely daring to blink. It was pinned as if someone had buckled themselves in and pulled it snug, and the fabric, it was darkened, wet. Droplets of water beaded and slid along the weave, soaking into the seat where clothing should have been. I told myself it had to be something explainable. Maybe I'd hit the brakes too hard earlier and the inertia had locked the belt. Maybe the water was from me tracking it in. But I hadn't used that seat all night. It had been empty since I'd left work. The road curved sharply, pulling my focus back to the windshield. The rain seemed heavier in the hollow, and the headlights were swallowed almost instantly by the black between the trees. The smell hit me then. Not strong, but distinct. Wet earth, moss, that raw metallic scent of rain-soaked leaves. It was out of place inside the cab, like I'd left a window down, but both were sealed tight. I kept my eyes forward, but the awareness of that seat beside me was unbearable. Every nerve screamed that something was there, whether I could see it or not. I wanted to pull over, to fling the belt off and check every inch. But the thought of stopping on that narrow, winding road felt worse. For the rest of the hollow, I drove faster than I should have, tires hissing in the water, hands locked on the wheel. I didn't look again until I saw the reflective green of the Leaving Ash Fork Hollow sign. When I glanced over, the belt was loose, coiled against the seat. The dark patch had faded like it had never been wet at all. I pulled into my driveway 15 minutes later and sat there with the engine running, the rain drumming on the roof. The passenger seat looked perfectly normal, but I didn't touch it. I got out and went inside, locking the door behind me like that would make a difference. It's been weeks since that night. I still take the long way around now, even if it adds 20 minutes. But some nights, especially when it rains, I swear I can feel that same presence, just out of sight, riding quietly in the space beside me. Story 5. Lanterns in the Pines. It was one of those nights where the air felt heavy before the rain even came. I had been on the road longer than I should have, headed back from a job site 2 towns over. The storm caught me just past 9. First the wind, bending the treetops, then fat drops hitting the hood of my truck like thrown gravel. I'd been planning to take the main highway home, but a wreck had shut it down, so I ended up winding through the back roads that cut across the hills. That's when I saw it. An old gravel road I didn't remember, angling off into the woods. The rain was getting worse, and I figured maybe it would save me a few miles. The road narrowed quickly, the gravel wet and loose under my tires. Branches reached across from both sides, scraping the sides of the truck when I hugged the middle too much. The rain was hammering now, so loud I could barely hear the engine. My headlights caught sheets of water rushing down the slope in front of me, the dirt between the stones turning into brown streams. That's when I noticed the lights. They were deep in the pines to my right, small, warm glows swaying gently in the darkness. At first I thought it was someone's campsite, maybe hunters riding out the storm. The light had that old yellow lantern hue, the kind that makes the air around it look like honey. But they were too far off the road for me to make out with any people. I slowed down, squinting through the rain-streaked glass, trying to see if there were tents or a fire. Then I realized the lights were moving, not drifting randomly like you'd expect from someone walking. They moved in perfect unison, weaving between the trunks in the same measured rhythm, each one turning exactly when the others did, never breaking formation. My first thought was that maybe they were on some kind of rig or cart being pulled through the woods. But there was no sound, no engine, no crunch of wheels, nothing above the hiss of the rain. A flash of lightning lit the trees white for an instant, and I saw them clearly. There were 4 lights, each hanging at the same height, and none of them were being carried. They floated. I gripped the wheel tighter and let my foot off the gas, coasting as my headlights pushed further down the road. The lights matched my pace, sliding between the trees without touching them. Every so often another flash of lightning would come, and they would be closer, not rushing me, just reducing the space. Something in me wanted to turn around, but the road was too narrow, and with the rain flooding it, backing out would have been a gamble. So I kept going, eyes darting between the road and the pines. The woods on that side were dense, and yet the lights navigated them without faltering, never catching on a branch, never slowing. After another quarter mile, the trees thinned just enough that the lights were almost parallel with me. I couldn't see beyond their glow. Everything outside that circle was black, but my gut told me that if I stopped, they'd stop too. The gravel gave way to a wider patch of dirt up ahead, and I considered pulling over to see if I could catch my breath. That's when the lights shifted. Without warning, they angled toward the road. I pressed harder on the gas, not flooring it, but enough to feel the tires grip and throw water behind me. I didn't want to look, but every few seconds my eyes betrayed me, flicking to the side. The lights had closed the distance to the first line of trees, still perfectly spaced, still gliding without sound. The rain thickened, making the wipers useless for long stretches. Every time the glass cleared, I expected to see them breaking from the woods, but they stayed just inside, following. Finally, the road curved sharply to the left, and for the first time in what felt like miles, the forest fell away into an open field. The lights didn't follow me into the clearing. They just stopped at the edge of the trees, holding there like they were waiting for something. I didn't slow down until I saw pavement again and the dim safety of a streetlight ahead. Even then, I checked my mirrors more than the road. I've been back in that area twice since, once in daylight. I found the turnoff, followed the gravel road. It went less than a mile before ending at a washout, no signs of fire pits or old camps. But when I stood there, looking into the pines, I had the same feeling I did that night, that if I stayed too long, I might see those lights again, sliding silently toward me through the trees. Story 6, The Singing Voice. It was the kind of rain that comes down like it's got a grudge against the earth, the kind that makes the whole world blur into a grey sheet. I'd been driving for an hour on a 2-lane road with no shoulder, no streetlights, and barely a painted line to follow. The wipers on my old Ford were working themselves half to death, squeaking with each pass. Then, without warning, they froze halfway up the glass. Just stopped. I tapped the switch, flipped it off and on. Nothing. The rain smeared across the windshield until it was like looking through a wet grocery bag. I eased off the gas, scanning for a place to pull over before I drove into a ditch. The high beams caught a sagging roofline off to the right. A little shape in the dark that might once have been a store. The front windows were gone, the boards warped and bowed. I figured it was as good a spot as any to stop before I ran off the road. Gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up beside it, the rain hammering the hood loud enough to feel in my teeth. I cut the engine, and for a moment there was just the hiss of the rain and the ticking of the cooling motor. Then I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, almost swallowed by the downpour, but there was no mistaking the sound. A woman, singing. The tune was slow, lilting, like something from an old music box. No words, just a melody that rose and fell in a way that made the hair on my arms stand straight. I sat there a long moment, trying to tell myself it was just the rain running through the gutters or the wind cutting across the broken boards of the store. But then it came again. Clearer. It wasn't coming from inside the building. It was out there in the dark somewhere, moving. Curiosity won out over common sense. I cracked my door, the rain instantly soaking my left side, and stepped out into the gravel. The air was cold and carried that wet, earthy smell you get after days of storms. The singing was still there, a little louder now, though I couldn't place the direction. I turned toward the sound. It shifted behind me. I turned again. Same thing. Behind me. It was like a cat circling, always staying just out of sight. I walked a few steps away from the truck, squinting into the trees at the edge of the lot. Lightning flashed, white and quick, lighting the world for just a second. Nothing but wet bark and dripping branches. But the singing kept on, soft and steady, like whoever it was had all the time in the world. A cold prickle crawled up the back of my neck. I don't know why, but the idea of calling out felt wrong, like if I let whoever or whatever knew I'd heard them, it would change something between us. I backed toward the truck, keeping my eyes on the tree line. The singing was still behind me, no matter how I turned, no matter how slow I moved. It never grew closer, never faded away. By the time I reached the driver's side, I was shaking, not from the cold, but from something older and harder to name. I climbed in, slammed the door, and sat there dripping rainwater onto the seat. The singing cut off instantly. The only sound was the rain drumming on the roof. It took me a moment to notice the dampness beneath me. Not the quick, cold wet of rain on my clothes, but a deep, soaked-in chill coming up through the seat. I pressed my hand to it, and my fingers came away wetter than they should have. The smell hit me then, a faint, sour scent, like old pond water clinging to fabric. The seat had been dry when I got out. I didn't look around. I didn't check the mirrors. I just started the engine and eased back onto the road, squinting through the blurred windshield, letting the headlights pull me forward. The wipers stayed dead the rest of the drive, but I never stopped again. And every so often, just under the hiss of the rain, I thought I could hear that same slow melody trailing along behind me. Story 7. The figure under the gas station light. By the time I pulled off the interstate, it was well past 2 in the morning, and the rain had been coming down for hours. One of those endless Appalachian storms that turns everything into water and shadow. I'd been driving since sunset, trying to make it to a motel 2 counties over, but the highway had turned into a blur of black asphalt and silver sheets of rain. I spotted the glow of a sign through the downpour. A gas station, the old kind. Single row of pumps under a floodlight that looked like it was hanging on by a thread. The lot was nearly empty, save for the standing water. It was pooled ankle deep in places, rippling under the wind, reflecting the pale, sickly light overhead. The building itself was one of those prefab concrete shells with a small glass door and faded posters taped inside. The rain hitting the tin awning made a sound like an empty drum, and the smell of wet asphalt filled the air. I pulled up beside the far pump and cut the engine, the wipers freezing mid-swipe like they were glad to be done. I was just reaching for my wallet when I noticed him. He was standing under the flickering floodlight, maybe 40 feet from my truck, right at the edge of the concrete where the lot bled into the blackness of the tree line. Tall, thin, wearing clothes that looked 30 years out of place. Pressed slacks, suspenders, a pale button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled once at the forearms. The kind of outfit you might see in an old family photo hanging in your grandmother's hallway. His hair was slicked back in a way that didn't belong to this decade, and he was staring straight at me. At first, I figured maybe he worked there, but there was something about the way he stood, feet together, arms hanging loose at his sides, that didn't look like waiting or loitering. It looked like being placed, like he'd been set there and told not to move. I raised my hand in a half wave, a small, polite gesture. He didn't respond. The rain was falling between us in shimmering silver sheets, but I could see enough of his face to tell he wasn't blinking. His mouth wasn't moving. The floodlight overhead gave a soft, electrical buzz, then blinked out for half a second. When it came back on, he was closer. I froze, my pulse hitting my throat like a hammer. He'd moved at least 10 feet without making a sound, without breaking eye contact. I told myself maybe I'd just misjudged the distance, the rain playing tricks, the way it always does when you're tired. Still, I called out, "You work here," trying to keep my voice steady. The sound barely made it over the rain, but I knew he'd heard me. His expression didn't change. The light overhead flickered again. When it came back, he was still closer. Maybe 15 feet away now, standing in one of the deeper pools of water. The floodlight glinted off the wet leather of his boots. I felt my mouth go dry. I'd been in bad neighborhoods, run into drunk strangers in parking lots, but this was different. This was wrong in a way I couldn't put into words. I backed toward my truck door without turning my back fully, fumbling for the handle. The light buzzed again, off. This time, it stayed dark longer. 5 seconds. 10. Long enough for the sound of the rain to fill my head. Long enough for the shadows around the lot to feel heavier, thicker. My fingers found the cold metal of the handle. I yanked the door open, slid into the driver's seat and slammed it shut. The light came back. The lot was empty. Empty. Except for the wet boot prints leading straight from where he'd been standing to my driver's side door. They were dark, heavy impressions, each one dripping into the shallow water, the leather tread sharp and clear. I followed them with my eyes until they ended at the bottom of my door. There were no prints leading away. I didn't bother looking around. I just jammed the keys into the ignition, praying the engine wouldn't stall. It turned over on the first try, the headlights sweeping across the lot. No sign of him, no movement except the rain. I pulled out fast, tires sending water in all directions. The road ahead was a tunnel of black, broken only by the weak yellow reach of my high beams. I didn't stop until I hit the state highway, and even then, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror. The boot prints stayed in my head all night. That perfect line from the tree line to my door, like he'd known exactly where I'd be, like he'd been waiting. And the worst part? When I finally made it to the motel and swung my legs out of the truck, the bottoms of my jeans were wet, just the hems, soaked through, like I'd stepped into that same pool of water he'd been standing in. I never saw him again, but I have not, in the years since, stopped looking over my shoulder every time I'm alone at a gas station in the dark. Story 8. The Roadside Child. It was the kind of storm you feel in your bones before you ever see the first drop. I'd been on the road since before sundown, winding my way through back roads in the hills, the kind where the forest leans in on both sides and the asphalt disappears into a black ribbon ahead. The rain started as a mist, then a drizzle, and by midnight it was pounding so hard that even with the wipers on full speed, I could barely see more than 20 feet in front of me. The old truck I was driving rattled with each gust, the wind shoving the rain sideways so it lashed against the glass like gravel. I wasn't planning on stopping until I made it to my uncle's place. He had a cabin up near the state line where I was supposed to crash for the night, but the storm was slowing me to a crawl. Every bend in the road felt sharper, every shadow heavier. I kept the radio low, more for company than anything else, though all it offered was static and the occasional burst of a country station that faded as quickly as it came. That's when I saw her. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, just the way the rain caught in the beams of my headlights. But no, she was there, standing on the narrow shoulder of the road, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, in a pale dress plastered to her skin, hair dripping in dark strands over her face. She was barefoot, toes sunk in the muddy runoff pooling at the edge of the pavement. I hit the brakes without thinking, the truck skidding a little before coming to a stop a few yards ahead of her. My first thought was that she'd been in some kind of accident, maybe wandered off from a wreck. I threw it in park, grabbed my flashlight, and shoved the door open. The rain was colder than I expected, slicing right through my jacket. I turned toward where she'd been. She wasn't there. Just the road, the trees, and the hiss of rain on asphalt. My headlights caught the wet gleam of the guardrail, the glint of water streaming down it, but no sign of her. I swung the beam of my flashlight over the shoulder into the ditch. That's when I saw them. Tiny footprints in the mud, heading toward the tree line. The toes were spread like she'd been running or moving quickly, and the edges of the prints were already starting to soften under the rain. I should have called someone. I should have gotten back in the truck and driven to the next town. But there's something about seeing a kid alone in the middle of nowhere during a storm that flips some switch in you. It doesn't feel optional. You go after them. The ditch was slick, my boots sinking into the muck with each step. I kept the flashlight low, following the prints as they climbed the slope toward the woods. The trees swayed and groaned overhead, their branches clacking in the wind. The deeper I went, the quieter the storm seemed to get. The wind still moved through the treetops, but down here, the air was thick and still. My breath came in slow, visible puffs in the beam of the flashlight. I kept following the footprints. About 50 yards in, they just stopped. One print, then another, then nothing. The mud was just as thick here as it had been before. If anything, it was softer from where water had pooled in shallow depressions, but there were no more tracks. I crouched down, shining the light in a slow circle around me. Nothing, not even a partial heel mark. I straightened up, frowning. That's when I saw them. Not hers, these were bigger, wider. The toes pointed inward just slightly, like whoever it was had been walking carefully, almost deliberately. And they weren't leading toward me. They were circling me. The rain had started to pick up again, but I could still make them out clearly in the mud. Deep, heavy impressions, overlapping slightly in places where the person must have shifted their weight. I spun, flashlight darting from tree to tree, trying to see where they'd gone. The prints trailed off into the darkness, but not before completing a perfect loop around where I was standing. The feeling that settled in my stomach wasn't fear, exactly. It was older than that. Something instinctive, primal, like realizing you've walked into the wrong clearing and the woods are holding their breath. I didn't call out, I didn't run, I just backed up slowly, retracing my own steps until I could see the faint glow of my headlights through the trees. The footprints, both hers and the larger ones, were already fading under the rain. By the time I climbed back into the truck, I was soaked through. I slammed the door, locked it, and sat there for a long moment, listening to the rain drum against the roof. The woods beyond the road were just shadows now, shifting in the wind. I put the truck in gear and pulled away, headlights slicing through the downpour. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I'd gone another mile, and when I finally did, I half expected to see a figure standing in the beam of the taillights. There was nothing. Still, I didn't sleep much that night at the cabin. I kept thinking about how small those first footprints had been, and how the second set had been spaced like someone taking long, patient steps. And I kept wondering if the girl had ever been there at all, or if she'd just been the reason I'd stepped off the road. Story 9, Radio Static. It had been raining since before I'd left work. One of those steady, unrelenting rains that soaks into everything and makes the whole world feel heavier. By the time I got on the highway, the sky was a single sheet of dull grey, already folding into black, even though it was only a little after 6. The wipers on my truck were working overtime, but the downpour blurred everything ahead into smudged shapes. Headlights from the occasional oncoming car flashed by like ghostly streaks, gone before I could really focus on them. I'd taken the same road home for years. 4 lanes at first, then narrowing to 2, winding into the hills where the trees pressed close on either side. It wasn't unusual for the reception on my old truck's radio to fade in and out once I left the city. You learned to live with it, especially out here, where half the time your phone might as well be a brick. That night, I wasn't paying much attention to the music. It was just background noise. Something to fill the cab so I didn't have to think about how tired I was. The rain was loud enough to muffle most of it anyway, and I caught myself leaning forward to see past the smeared arcs of the wiper blades. My shoulders were tight from hunching over the wheel, my fingers sore from gripping it. Then it happened. The song that had been playing, some old country number, just stopped. No slow fade. No glitch. It was there 1 second, and gone the next, replaced by a burst of static so loud I winced and reached for the knob. I never touched it. The static softened almost immediately, thinning into a low hiss. At first I thought maybe the storm had knocked the station out completely, and I was just hearing the normal background interference. But then I realized there was something underneath it. Something patterned. Voices. They were faint, almost blending with the hiss, like trying to make out a conversation through a wall. I leaned in slightly, the steering wheel pulling under my hands as the road curved. The rain seemed to dull, not because it was letting up, but because I was listening so hard. It wasn't random chatter. They weren't just talking. They were talking about me. My name came first, clear as day, spoken by a voice I didn't recognize, low, deliberate like it was weighing the word in its mouth. Then another voice answered, this one higher, almost whispering, but urgent. I couldn't catch everything, but the pieces I did made my skin go cold. He's on 33 now. Past the mill. Slowing down. I checked my mirrors instinctively, but there was nothing behind me except the streaks of rain in my taillights. No headlights, no signs of life in the dark, tree-choked road. I reached for the dial again, fingers brushing the cold plastic. That's when the first voice came back, closer somehow, like it had leaned right up to the speaker. He's almost here. I yanked my hand back and hit the power button. The cab fell into a heavy, unnatural silence, broken only by the sound of the wipers and the steady drumming of the rain. My heart was in my throat. I didn't know why, but I didn't want to hear what came next. The road narrowed as it climbed into the hills, and the trees pressed closer, their black shapes towering over me in the glow of the headlights. The air inside the truck felt heavier now, stale. Every creak of the frame as it shifted on the wet pavement sounded louder than it should. I tried to tell myself it was just interference. Storms did strange things to radio signals. Hell, sometimes you could pick up stations from other states without meaning to. But that didn't explain how they knew my name. It didn't explain how they knew exactly where I was. The miles ticked by slower than usual. My exit was coming up, a narrow turnoff onto a smaller road that led past a scattering of old farms and then deeper into the hills. I lived out past the last gas station, past where the county bothered to salt in the winter, where the only sound most nights was the wind moving through the trees. Normally, I liked it that way, but not tonight. When I took the turn, my headlights swept across the empty lot of a boarded-up feed store. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows by the side of the building, a pale blur. But by the time I blinked, it was gone. Probably just the rain. I kept telling myself that. The new road was worse. Potholes filled with black water, patches of slick mud where the asphalt had worn away completely. The trees leaned in overhead, their branches clawing together in the wind. My high beams caught the pale shapes of reflector posts, but they seemed fewer and farther between out here, like even the road markers didn't bother sticking around. It was around then that I noticed the hum. Not from the radio, it was still off, but from somewhere deeper in the truck. A low, steady vibration, almost mechanical but not quite. It pulsed in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I turned the fan off, just to be sure, but the hum stayed. I thought about pulling over, but the idea of stepping out into that dark, wet silence made my stomach knot. I gripped the wheel harder and kept going, eyes fixed on the ribbon of road ahead. Then the radio clicked back on. I swear to God I didn't touch it. The power light blinked red, and the speakers filled with static again. My hand shot out to turn it off, but I froze when the voices came back, clearer this time. Right there. Keep him on the road. Don't let him. The last voice was cut off, replaced by a new one. A voice I knew. It was my own. Hollow, distorted by the static, but unmistakable. He's almost here. I slammed the power button so hard the plastic clicked under my thumb. The silence afterward felt thick enough to choke on. I drove the rest of the way with both hands white-knuckled on the wheel, the hum still vibrating in the cab like something breathing just out of sight. When I finally pulled into my driveway, a rutted stretch of gravel ending in a clearing barely big enough for the truck, I didn't move for a long moment. The rain had slowed to a mist, but the trees around the property were black and dripping, their branches hanging low like they were listening. I shut the truck off. The hum stopped immediately. Inside, the house felt colder than usual. I turned on the lights in every room, not because I needed them to see, but because I needed the illusion of safety. I stood at the kitchen sink, watching the yard through the window. Nothing moved out there. Before I went to bed, I unplugged the radio from the truck, took the fuse out too. I didn't want to hear it again. That was 3 weeks ago. I still take the same road to and from work, but I drive in silence now. Sometimes though, when the rain is heavy enough, I swear I can feel the hum through the steering wheel. And every now and then, just under the sound of the tires on wet pavement, I think I hear my name. Story 10. The porch visitor. The power went out right around midnight. The storm had been building all evening, slow grumbles rolling over the hills, wind worrying the trees like some restless hand. And by the time the lights cut out, the rain was already hammering the tin roof hard enough to drown out my own thoughts. My cabin sits a few miles outside town, far enough from the main road that the only light you get at night is whatever the sky's willing to give you. And tonight, the sky wasn't in the mood to share. I lit a candle, set it on the little table by the window, and sat back in my chair, figuring I'd just wait the worst of it out. I've never been bothered by storms. Truth be told, I usually find them comforting. Makes the whole world feel smaller when you can't see beyond the glow of your own window. But that night, there was something about the air, thick and restless, like it was waiting for something. The rain kept shifting directions with the wind, rattling the window panes. Every so often, lightning would flare somewhere deep in the clouds, just enough to cast the woods in a faint white wash, but never long enough to see clearly. The thunder followed slower than it should have, like it was dragging its feet getting here. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, watching the dark outline of the porch through the glass. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just the shadow of one of the porch posts, bent strangely in the candlelight, but it wasn't standing where a post should be. There was a figure, tall, too tall, standing dead center in front of my door. I couldn't make out much more than the outline, just this long, narrow shape swaying slightly as if it were breathing. I called out, my voice louder than I meant it to be. "Hey, you all right out there?" No answer. The figure didn't so much as flinch. Lightning flashed, sharp and sudden, and in that brief second I saw it for real. Something draped in what looked like wet burlap, hanging heavy from its shoulders all the way to the porch floor. The fabric was matted to its form, but not enough to show a face or arms, and where a head should have been, the shape just kept going. Tall enough that the top brushed the eaves, the light was gone before my brain caught up to what I'd seen. I stayed there, frozen, the sound of rain filling every inch of silence between us. "Do you need help?" I tried again, but my voice cracked halfway through. Still nothing. No movement, no sound except the hiss of the rain on the porch roof. It was like it was waiting for something, though I couldn't have said what. Minutes passed. I told myself it was just some drunk who'd gotten lost, maybe wrapped themselves in a tarp, maybe taller than average. I told myself a lot of things I didn't believe. The storm wore on, and every so often, another flash of lightning would come, but never quite like the first time. The light would glance off the burlap in dull streaks, glistening in places where it was soaked through, but it never gave me a clean look. And still, it never moved. At some point, I realized my candle had burned down enough that my reflection was faint in the glass. And for a moment, I got the uneasy sense that it was looking back at me, though it had no eyes to do so. I thought about going to the back door and out through the yard, maybe circling around with a flashlight, but the idea of stepping outside, leaving the safety of walls between us, made my skin crawl. I stayed put, watching. Hours passed. My legs went numb from sitting so long in one position. The rain eased from a downpour to a steady sheet, and still it stood there, unmoving. When the rain finally stopped, the silence hit harder than the storm had. You don't realize how much noise rain makes until it's gone. The night felt hollow without it. I sat there, staring, waiting for it to leave. but it never did. Sometime before dawn, I must have dozed off in the chair. I woke to pale light leaking through the window, my neck stiff, the candle long since burned out. The porch was empty. I went to the door, half expecting to see footprints or scraps of burlap caught in the boards, but what I found was worse. The wood planks in the center of the porch, right where it had stood, were warped, bowed inward like something impossibly heavy had been pressing down on them all night. The nails had pulled up from the strain, and the boards were damp in a way that didn't match the rest of the porch, almost like whatever had been there had left its weight behind. I didn't touch them, didn't step outside, just closed the door, locked it, and sat back down. I still live in the same cabin. I fixed the porch, replaced the boards, but I've never sat by that window during a storm again. And sometimes when the rain starts up just right and the wind cuts through the trees, I swear I hear the boards creak in that same slow, steady rhythm, like something standing out there again, waiting for me to look.